Have you ever thought about what you would do if your engine quit over a populated area? And have you wondered what it might be like to pull a whole airplane parachute and ride the plane down to the ground during an emergency? Well, stick around for our conversation with Jim Simon, who will tell you what that is like. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk in general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 335, we talked with Dr. Victor Vogel about mental health issues and what pilots need to know when getting a pilot medical certificate. So if you didn't hear that episode, you might want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/335. And if you're new to the show, welcome. So glad that you found us and you've joined us. Now, if you would, we'd like to have you stick around. So take a moment right now, and on the app that you're using, touch either the subscribe key or in the Spotify or Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show and that we have several ways that you can show your love and support for the show. It's easy to do. Just go out to our support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via Patreon, PayPal, Venmo, and Zelle. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up in the news the week of June 24th, 2024, Van's Aircraft issues a service bulletin following a fatal crash. Lycoming might not honor warranty claims if you use G100UL fuel. And some high-flying senior citizens got to fly. All this and more, and the news starts now. From FlyingMag.com, owners and operators of Van's Aircraft RV-12 and RV-12IS models are instructed to inspect the control stick assembly to verify proper installation before their next flight. Van said it issued the service bulletin this Monday, quote, out of an abundance of caution following a fatal RV-12 crash earlier in the month, after it appeared that the control stick on the pilot's side disconnected while in flight due to improper assembly. The aircraft was a home built and the pilot was the builder. The release of Service Bulletin 102 comes as the NTSB released its preliminary findings of the June 6 accident where this RV-12 pilot lost control authority and crashed during an attempt to land at Auburn Municipal Airport south of Seattle. The pilot overflew the airport from the east and announced over the CTAF that he intended to enter left traffic for runway 35. ADSB data indicates that in the 60 seconds after making the transmission, the airplane entered a descent from 1,500 to 1,250 feet. As it rolled onto the left downwind, the pilot transmitted, Pan, RV-412 Juliet November. I just had a control failure. I'm inbound for 35 without any controls. Multiple pilot witnesses told the NTSB that the airplane began a descending turn to the left, described as a spin or spiral dive. A security camera captured the final 3 seconds of the flight, in which the aircraft was inverted in a 45-degree nose-down attitude. The preliminary investigation included reviewing the plans for the aircraft, which determined that the inboard eye bolts on the accident airplane were installed upside down, which allowed the stud ends of the eye bolt to rotate within the threaded inboard section of the push rod until the left control stick had become disconnected. Investigators determined the airframe had approximately 100 hours on it at the time of the accident. From avweb.com, Lycoming clarifies G100UL warranty impact. Lycoming has confirmed that it may not honor warranty claims on engines that have been run on GAMI G100UL unleaded fuel. In a statement to AvWeb, the company said that G100UL is not on its list of approved fuels, and while warranty claims are assessed individually, the warranty does not cover damage caused by operation outside of Lycoming's published specifications or the use of non-approved fuels or lubricants. The company did not say what is required to make that list, but it includes leaded and unleaded aviation fuels and some unleaded automotive fuels. Its highest performance engines are generally restricted to 100 low lead in North America. Lycoming was responding to a legal opinion offered by an AvWeb reader who is a lawyer and a high-performance single owner who disputed the claim. He said that since G100UL is approved by the FAA through an STC, engine manufacturers can't reject warranty claims based on use of the fuel. And also from avweb.com, FAA seeks AirVenture pilot volunteers for cognitive testing. Pilots attending AirVenture 2024 in Oshkosh, Wisconsin could offset some of their expense by participating in a paid FAA research study. The agency is offering prepaid gift cards valued at between $300 and $500, depending upon the current medical privileges at the time of the study. Participants must have logged flight or simulator time within the previous 6 months. This year, the FAA is looking for 160 pilots with Class 3 medicals who are at least 25 years old, 14 pilots with Class 2 or Class 1 certificates who are 60-plus years old are also required. The FAA Institutional Review Board approved testing will take about 4 hours. It involves 2 computerized cognitive tests for working memory, attention, mental rotation, and multitasking performance. According to the FAA, the purpose of the study is to obtain pilot normative data for these computerized tests. The FAA uses these tests to help recertify pilots for flying following a medical event, e.g., stroke, head injury, and certain medication. The results of the study will help ensure that aeromedical decision-making is based on the most current scientific data and will contribute to the safety of the National Airspace System. And also from avweb.com, NTSB releases preliminary report on 2 airline close calls. The NTSB published a pair of preliminary reports on close calls involving airliners at the Burbank Airport in California and the JFK Airport in New York. The near miss at JFK occurred on April 17th when a Swiss Airbus A330 crew aborted its takeoff from runway 4 left after spotting conflicting taxiing traffic on the runway. In that incident, one controller had cleared the Swiss Air flight for takeoff, while a ground controller had cleared 4 other airlines to cross the same runway. And I've seen the diagram. They were all at different intersections, so all 4 of those airliners were potentially on the runway at the same time. Unlike another incident last year at JFK, the Swiss Air Airbus did not trigger the ASDX airport surveillance detection equipment since the aircraft did not attain the required acceleration and velocity levels to qualify as a departure state. But the alert crew spotted the crossing traffic and discontinued the takeoff. In February 2023 at the Hollywood Burbank Airport, crews of both an inbound Mesa Airlines CRJ-900 and a SkyWest Embraer EMB-170 responded to Traffic Collision Alert System's resolution advisories averting a collision. According to this week's preliminary report, at their closest point, the 2 aircraft were determined to be within 1,700 feet of each other. From KSDK.com, helicopter landing destroys vendors' products and tents at St. Francis County Fair in Missouri. Several small business owners are devastated after an accident at the fair over the weekend. A helicopter landed in the wrong area, destroying their products and tents. Cindy Bayless and Jessica Harris own the craft shop Cindy's Corner. Bayless said, quote, "The event time is what we depend on to make our money to put it back to keep going during the winter time. They paid $320 to set up at the St. Francis County Fair, and before day 2 on Saturday even got started, their hard work was ruined." Bayless said, quote, "We were told there was supposed to be a helicopter show, I guess for kids or whatever, and for some reason, the helicopter landed in the field right next to everybody, all of the tents." She said they lost their products, the tents were destroyed, and they barely made enough money to cover their participation fee. And I've seen photos, and indeed several of the tents were completely destroyed, and all the goods were scattered all over the ground. And this is a good wake-up call for pilots to remember, depending upon what you fly, you are responsible for the effects of your jet blast and certainly for your rotor downwash as well. And from our You're Grounded file, man faces prison for uncertificated flight. A non-pilot with a long criminal history who crashed an illegally modified Piper PA-18 into a hangar in Alaska Airport Community 2 years ago faces a lengthy federal prison sentence to be imposed in August for flying without a pilot certificate and displaying fraudulent aircraft registration markings. The pilot, age 63, who gained notoriety as a, quote, celebrity wildlife fugitive more than a decade before the events charged in his most recent indictments, pleaded guilty to 2 federal charges. He admitted he was guilty of operating an aircraft without a pilot certificate and for displaying fraudulent registration markings stemming from a 2022 aircraft accident at Wolf Lake, a private airport between Wasilla and Palmer, Alaska. According to the NTSB, he told investigators that his engine began to lose power soon after takeoff. He encountered difficulty 100 feet into the climb, attempted to restore power by applying carb heat and changing the fuel tank selector switch. Quote, but those actions did not restore power, in part because the MOL-type fuel selector switch had been mislabeled. Specifically, the position labeled both was for the right tank, the position labeled left was the off position, and the position labeled right was for the left tank, and the position labeled off was for both tanks. At the time of the crash, the aircraft was registered with the FAA as a normal category aircraft, but the defendant had installed several aircraft components that were not permitted for a PA-18 series aircraft. To conceal these prohibited items, he knowingly and willfully displayed placarding on the window that read experimental in 2-inch black letters, falsely indicating that the aircraft was registered as an experimental category aircraft. The potential penalties for both charges listed in the plea agreement are identical: 3 years in prison, a $250,000 fine, 1 year of supervised release, and a $100 special assessment. And in other news from FAA.gov, according to the FAA, a Cirrus SR-20 practicing stalls went into a spin and deployed its parachute near Litchfield, Michigan. The plane belonged to Western Michigan University, which reported that everyone landed safely in a field with no injuries. According to the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association, it was the 130th save by the CAPS parachute. Of course, we'll be talking about that more in our main topic when we talk with Jim Simon about his parachute pull. From globalair.com, another week-long job fair will be held during AirVenture this year. The job fair will be held Monday, July 22nd to July 27th. You're encouraged to stop by and see what new opportunities are available across the industry. And I've looked at the list. There are 34 companies so far on the list, many of which are major companies that you've heard of. And from avweb.com, the FAA is looking for AI or artificial intelligence help. Facing a major controller shortage, the FAA is asking AI for help. The agency has issued a request for information calling on the AI industry for ideas on how to use the new technologies to improve aviation safety. Quote, the FAA envisions a new safety analytics system that will vastly expand and accelerate insights from current and additional sources of data and provide a comprehensive understanding of causal factors of safety events to help predict high-risk operations and environments. And finally, from foxcarolina.com, a volunteer celebrates his 101st birthday by taking to the sky. Uncle John Hartness is a volunteer at Triple Tree Aerodrome in Woodruff, South Carolina, which is a renowned nonprofit dedicated to aviation education and heritage preservation. Hartness has wanted to fly since he was a little boy and prayed to God that it one day would become a reality. He said, quote, the reason I fly is when I was a little boy, the airplanes would come over the house. This was back in the 20s and 30s. One day after one went over, I watched it until it was out of sight. And I said, God, if you let me be able to fly, I will give you half of my life. The nonprofit honored Hartness with a special flight in one of their aircraft. And in a similar story from the UK, this comes from BBC.com, a 97-year-old woman's wish came true when she was given a helicopter ride on her birthday. Staff at Broadway Hall's care home in Dudley in West Midlands arranged the treat for resident Gwen Jinks. She took off from Wolverhampton Halfpenny Green Airport, which I've looked it up. It's about 100 miles northwest of London. She said the whole thing was absolutely beautiful. So if you have an opportunity, take a senior citizen flying. And heck, someday I may be asking you for a ride. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and then our conversation with Jim Simon about his parachute pull, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about a really interesting accident that Peter Garrison wrote about in Flying Magazine, so stick around for that. Now let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Aaron Weisblatt, who passed his multi-engine rating. He says, I understand you're in Los Angeles. That was a couple weeks ago. I'm a faithful listener. I just received my multi-engine rating and have been waiting to complete the training before supporting your show. Aaron, thanks so much for that. And of course, you can always support the show before you complete a rating as well. And congratulations to James Schultz on his CFI and II. He wanted to say, thanks again for information-packed episode 333. I was surprised while listening about hearing a Mayday call to hear the tail number 739 Tango Whiskey. I recognized it as a West Valley plane that I had flown early on in my aviation life. And when I returned home, I checked my logbook and discovered it was the plane that I took my first intro flight in back in 2007 with CFI Ted Tilton. And by the way, on Tuesday night, we had a retirement party for Ted. He's up in his mid-80s at this point. One of my good friends from the club. He's a great guy. Let's see. He continues, I'm happy to hear 739 Tango Whiskey and all occupants are safely back on the ground. Somewhat coincidental timing hearing this, since I just returned from completing my CFI and II and will now be on the hunt for aircraft to start getting my own demo flights and training in. Fingers crossed that their engines keep running, though. Yes, I agree with you there. Again, congratulations, James. Now, just a quick update on what I've been up to. 2 weeks ago, I finished USC's Aviation Safety and Security Certificate program. To complete the certificate, you need to take a total of 4 courses in different categories. Now, that entailed spending a total of 6 weeks in Los Angeles. Back in December, I spent 2 weeks in the Aircraft Accident Investigation course, which I talked about before. They have about 10 aircraft wrecks, and we spent a lot of time analyzing the wreckage to see what we could determine about the accidents. People came in from around the world to attend. Many of them were in safety roles for their companies or worked for the equivalent to the NTSB in their country. So many of these people were actively doing accident investigation work, and that was the course I was most interested in attending, primarily so that I could do a better job of sharing accurate information with you here on the podcast. And I probably thought at the time that it would be the only course I would take, but once I had a taste of the program, I was motivated to continue. In March, I spent another 2 weeks, 1 week in the Helicopter Accident Investigation course, which I talked about in episode 322 and our visit to the Robinson Helicopter Factory, which was fabulous. I really loved that. And the following week, I took the Human Factors course, a subject in which I've always had a deep interest. And I might have stopped there, but I only needed to take 1 more course to complete the program. And when the FAA announced 2 months ago that they were going to require Part 135 charter companies to implement SMS programs, I decided to go back sooner than planned. And so for these last 2 weeks, I was in their SMS, or Safety Management System course, which I highly recommend to you if you're working in an aviation-related company in either a senior management or safety role. I knew relatively little about SMS, but frankly, it was probably the most valuable course I took there. So if you can only take 1 course, I highly recommend the Safety Management System course. Now, one of my goals in taking that course was to see if there are ways that SMS, which is typically used in organizations, could be scaled down to help pilots who fly single pilot, either for fun or as a single pilot for business. And while some of it can apply, a lot of it would be difficult to implement, which is too bad, as I think it would improve safety for all of us who fly in a single pilot environment. But I have started writing up some notes about this, so I'll come back again in the future here for an episode about SMS, and both of how it can be used in organizations and how it might apply to single pilot flying. Now here's an email from Patreon supporter Carl Howd. He wrote, "Sad news out of KLWM tonight. Pilot of an RV-6 crashes into the Merrimack River after reporting problems with aircraft." He said that not much was said over the radio other than the pilot said he had a problem, and Tower issued a landing clearance for any runway. The pilot bypassed the crosswind runway and crashed further down the downwind. Passing the crosswind at less than a mile and 500 feet has me thinking the pilot was probably heads down trying to figure out how to fix the issue. Just heartbreaking. And let me just jump in here with a comment. I think we as pilots get programmed to using the same runway, 95% of the time, such that in an emergency, we don't think about using other runways. We just continue for the one that we're used to using. Yet, if you had an engine-out emergency after takeoff, in many cases it would be easier to make it back to one of the other runways than the one you just departed from. So think through possible emergencies in advance and envision using some of those less commonly used runways at your airport or at other airports you visit. He continues, "I dropped all my queued podcasts to listen to yours on release day." Well, thank you. He says, "Why would I put off something that could save my life someday? Hope the exposure to those stories, plus chair flying these emergencies via ADS-B playback, plus time with an instructor practicing emergency procedures more frequently than required, will mean something if the chips are down for me someday." I'm sure they will. Thanks for being part of that equation, even if we never know the accidents that didn't happen because of all this. Carl, thanks so much, and thanks for being a supporter of the show. And yeah, one of the things that we learned in the SMS course is that you really can't measure the safety of your organization by the absence of accidents because they happen so infrequently, and you really need to be looking at other smaller kinds of things to become safer as an organization. And now let's talk about the article that Peter Garrison wrote for Flying Magazine. And while in some ways the accident sounds all too familiar, it has an interesting twist at the end, so stick around for that. In late June 2020, a 40-year-old oil industry executive left David Wayne Hook's Memorial, KDWH, near Houston alone in his Saratoga. He arrived over his destination, a private strip 90 miles to the northeast, 36 minutes later. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. Not a great time to be flying, folks. The air on the surface was warm and humid. If he checked the weather, there was no evidence that he did. He would have expected to find widespread but patchy cloudiness over the route of flight and at the destination. In some places, clouds were broken or scattered with tops at 3,000. Elsewhere, buildups climbed into the flight levels. Ceilings and visibilities under the clouds were good, at worst 700 feet and 5-mile visibility. The temperature and the dew point were only 3 degrees apart, and there was a slightly increased risk of fog formation. During the short flight, he climbed to 3,600 feet, probably to get above some cloud tops. It was pitch dark as the crescent moon was far below the horizon. As he neared his destination, he descended to 1,500 feet MSL, 1,300 feet above the terrain, and reduced his ground speed from 175 to 100 knots. The airstrip at which he intended to land was 3,500 feet long, 40 feet wide, and had a light gray concrete surface oriented along runways 422. There was no edge lights along the runway. The only lights were 3 red ones marking the runway ends. The surrounding area was largely dark. For almost an hour, the pilot flew back and forth over the airstrip, seemingly random right and left turns. His altitude varied between 350 and 1,100 feet AGL, and his ground speed between 65 and 143 knots. His ground track, as recorded by radar, suggested no systematic plan, but it was broadly centered on the northeast end of the runway. The last return from the Saratoga, recorded 54 minutes after it arrived over the field, put it 9,700 feet from the northeast end of the runway on a close-in extended left downwind leg for runway 22 at a height of 350 feet AGL and a ground speed of 94 knots. The Saratoga was below radar for the remainder of the flight. Its burned wreckage was found at the southern edge of the clear-cut area surrounding the runway, several hundred feet short of the threshold. In the course of the investigation, it emerged that the airplane was out of annual, its last inspection having occurred in 2017, so 3 years before. The registration had expired, and the pilot's medical was out of date. The pilot had an estimated 400 hours, but did not have an instrument rating. In fact, he had only a student certificate. The autopsy turned up residues of amphetamine, methamphetamine, and THC, but investigators did not rule out the possibility that the drugs could have had a therapeutic purpose. The NTSB report declines to speculate on whether the drugs impaired the pilot in any way. In fact, the report concedes that, quote, the pilot's aircraft handling was not deficient relative to his limited experience of flying in night instrument conditions and the prolonged periods of approach attempts. The finding of probable cause cited only the pilot's poor decision-making as he attempted to land at an unlit airstrip in night instrument conditions. Yeah, not a great decision. It says the pilot bought the Saratoga in 2016 and then took flying lessons, but he stopped short of getting the private certificate. His instructor said he had never given him any instrument training. The pilot's wife said that he normally flew to the airport at night and circled down until he could see the runway. And then Peter writes, I leave it to you to applaud or deplore the nonconformist aspects of this pilot's actions. Perhaps a certain amount of freelancing is inevitable in an activity like flying, but I deprecate his persistence. One of the essential arrows in every pilot's quiver should be knowing when to quit. He set himself a nearly impossible goal, and after flying half an hour to his destination, he spent nearly an hour trying to figure out how to get onto the ground. If it was that difficult, it wasn't worth doing. There were other airports with runway lights nearby. And here's the kicker. At the time of the crash, the pilot was awaiting the decision of a Houston court in a wrongful termination lawsuit that he had filed against a former employer. 5 months later, the court found in his favor to the tune of $143 million. Thanks to a terminal case of get-home-itis, however, he wasn't there to enjoy it. And here's a review that was left in the Apple Podcast app, but it really is a question. Now, that's not the best place to leave questions because there's no way for me to reply to them in the review section, but hopefully High G Flyer, who posted that, is listening, so he'll hear this. He says, Max, you are the very best at aviation podcast. You are in a league of your own. Any pilot who trains with you hit the lottery on CFI selection. It sounds like this was written by my mom, but thanks very much. That's very complimentary. He says, I'm a former Air Force supersonic jet instructor, pilot, and airline pilot. Your guest on this episode, and he's referring to our discussion with John Fiskus, is clearly an outstanding CFI, continually refers to pilots as customers. For some reason, that sounds like a Walmart patron instead of a pilot or student pilot. Never heard that term used before in aviation. What are your thoughts on this, Max? Well, I went back to the transcript for episode 334, and in it, John said, it also reinforces to your customers, your clients, your students, however you want to refer to them. And so you can see he recognizes that many of us use different kinds of terms. And by the way, just to let you know, I counted, and John used the word customer 20 times. The word client was used 6 times, 3 times by me. And the word student was used 33 times, 3 times by me. I don't use student that often because I'm often working with people who are not student pilots, but people who have advanced ratings. So, for example, I just worked with a gentleman earlier this week who wants to get his multi-engine commercial, and he already owns a Phenom 300. He has a helicopter rating. He's got a lot of aviation experience. And so referring to him as student, to me, just doesn't feel quite right. And I took a look at this online, and it says in a hierarchical student-teacher relationship, the teacher is at the center of the educational process and has authority over the students' needs. This can marginalize students. And to me, it's never felt right calling folks like that students. I'd like to think that it's more of a partnership where we're working together. And so I tend to refer to the people I work with as the clients. John, it sounds like, tends to use the word customer more. I don't use that. I would use that perhaps when people are buying one of my books. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. Thanks so much for leaving a review. And I would encourage anyone to leave a review in whatever app you listen to. So if you listen to us on Spotify or the Apple Podcast app, go ahead and leave a review and let people know what you think about the show. And of course, another way to show your support for the show is to sign up to support the show financially. If you've been listening for a while and you feel like you're getting value from the show, then I'd encourage you to do what a number of other listeners have done. It takes just a couple of minutes. I would say if you would just stop what you're doing right now because you think you'd like to do it and you just won't remember to get around to it later. Go ahead and stop doing what you're doing for just a couple of minutes. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/support and you'll see different options for how you can support the show. And when you're trying to figure out how much to donate, well, you might just think about how much would you pay to go out to fly for an hour and maybe get some good instruction. Thanks so much for your support. And of course, aviation is a small community, so take a listen and see if you know any of these people who've supported the show in the past week. We have a couple of new Patreon supporters. My thanks to Ian and to Carl Reynolds. We also had some people who make one-time donations via PayPal. Special thanks to Billy Strauss Music, to John Dietz, to Robert Darwin, and to Stan at Force Kite in Wake in South Carolina. Thanks so very much for your support. Coming up next, our conversation with Jim Simon about his CAPS parachute pull. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Jim Simon. He's a 15,000-hour Cirrus CSIP instructor with multi-engine ratings, and he's the chief flight instructor at Rainier Flight Service at the Renton Airport in Washington State. And by the way, that's where they build the 737. And now here's our conversation with Jim Simon. Jim, welcome to the show. Great to have you here today.
Thank you.
Well, you're in a kind of a small exclusive club. We'll get to your parachute pull in a moment. But tell us a little bit about your current job, what you do, and how you happen to be on a Cirrus that particular day.
Yeah, I am a chief flight instructor at a large flight school in the Seattle area. That's my big day job. And then I work at a club as a CSIP/flight instructor and teach in the Cirrus for transition training, 6-month checks, etc.
All right, great. So tell us about the day of the flight. Anything unusual when you woke up to go to work that day or just another day?
It was a beautiful winter day. I guess it's still winter in March, right? Here in Seattle, it sure is. And we were planning to do a 6-month recurrency with one of the club members that transitioned in the Cirrus and been flying it for about 6 months or so.
Okay. So this was just a couple of months ago when this happened. Sounds like you're flying with someone who's already a licensed private pilot.
Correct.
Tell us about the flight. How did it start out and what happened?
So the goal was to do a VFR recurrency and go through some maneuvers, do landings, and continue our beautiful day. Everything started very normal. I actually had a flight before that in that same airplane. I flew 2.6 hours, and all indications were in the green through that flight. Not a bell or whistle that was dinging. Everything was normal. We pre-flighted for the next flight, taxied out, did our run-up. Everything was normal. Everything was in the green. Everything was happy, including the pilots. We took off runway 34 out of Renton Airport, and we were assigned the East Channel departure, which is a VFR departure procedure. It basically gets you over the East Channel, which is part of Lake Washington, and you climb out to avoid other deltas and other bravos. Engine was making normal power. We climbed up VY at 1,000 feet, which is traffic pattern altitude. We transitioned to a 120 knot climb. We did our cruise climb check and continued our climb to our top altitude of 2,500 feet MSL. Just before we reached 2,500 feet MSL, we're about to get ready to settle in for level flight. I heard 2 surges of the engine, and 2 seconds later, a big bang, and the propeller completely came to a stop. The engine ceased, which was a very interesting situation because you're used to engine noise, and it gets really, really quiet for a second or so when the engine stops. It ceased. My learner was flying. I took control because he kind of froze up for about 10 or 15 seconds and didn't really know what to do. And that was the time where, it was time for me to get to work. So I took control of the airplane. I went through my A, B, C, D, E checklist, my mental checklist, airspeed, best place to land checklist, declaring emergency, execute the emergency. I looked to my left, and there was a dense urban area of Mercer Island off to the left of me. To the right was Highway 405, which is a major highway here in the Seattle area. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so traffic was bumper to bumper. And I didn't think that was the best place to steer the airplane towards. We were right over the water. And if there's one thing I hate is swimming after you ditch the plane. I really hate that. So I opted not to pull the parachute there. So I saw a little greenbelt. Cold Creek Parkway is there. And I figured if I can get the airplane towards that area, it gets me away from the dense urban area, and we're going to pull there. There was no doubt in my mind after we went through the restart procedure, and the propeller didn't even move. There was no kick. There was nothing, that we were going to pull the parachute. We determined that our minimum pull altitude was going to be 1,500 feet MSL, which was going to be 1,000 feet AGL. So it's above 2,000 consider and below 2,000 pull. I don't think Cirrus even talks about thinking about the possibility of landing the airplane, because reality is most pilots can't pull it off. Once we got to that altitude, which took about 70 seconds of gliding, where we lost 1,000 feet and traveled about 2-point-some miles, we got to the end of our glide. We pulled the parachute, and really interesting, you read about this and you watch some videos about how the caps pull takes place. And I got to tell you, it was pretty violent. The moment the chute gets pulled, the rocket launches out, and you're just hanging in your seatbelts like you're coming back from a roller coaster ride, and you're getting back in the station, and the train is braking really hard. That's how it felt. Also, interesting fact is the nose goes straight down. So you're looking at Mother Earth after you pull. And that's typically not a view you have as a pilot, right? Typically, you're just looking straight out and seeing all those houses below you is not a good look. There was some high tension power lines just ahead of us, and I was trying to glide past them, and my plan was just to pull just past them. Unfortunately, we got to our minimum pull altitude, and there was no time or altitude left. So we pulled just before that. And I remember just looking at these power lines as the airplane is pointing straight down, and I'm looking straight out to these big power lines, and I'm like, oh boy, we're really, really close. I hope that we're not going to hit them, because I don't know how it's going to work. I'm not an engineer, but I was imagining that I was going to get either be fried or be on fire, be fried, be on fire, and then fall out of the power lines and still have a plane crash. Luckily, that didn't happen. I think we pulled just in time to be short about 50 feet of the power lines. As you know, the chute will slow the airplane down between 8 and 10 seconds, basically from best glide speed to 15 miles an hour. And as soon as that happened, I was assured that we were not going to hit the power lines, which brought me to the next part, which is, where are we going to land? So I started looking straight down, and I saw that we were getting into like a marshy area with blackberry bushes, with some dead trees sticking out. And I thought by myself, well, that's pretty good. We're not going to land on a house or in someone's driveway or, on a road. This actually looks like a really good spot. So more luck than anything else, but it seems like we pulled just at the right time. The trip down on the parachute was interesting as well, because the nose was oscillating, and maybe there's some videos online, maybe you can see it there. We oscillated between level pitch attitude and looking straight down again for at least 3 or 4 times, which was a little concerning. I didn't think that it would look like that, but just probably about 100 feet over the ground, 150 feet over the ground, the pitch attitude kind of stayed constant, maybe 5-degree negative pitch attitude or so. And I remember pulling my knees back from the dashboard and telling my learner to brace for impact, because I was ready for a really big impact. That never happened. It was like falling on a bed of pillows. It was so soft that after we landed, we looked at each other for just about a second or two, and we kind of couldn't believe that was it. And literally, that was it. I opened the door on my side and evacuated the airplane. Took my learner with me, told him to keep walking away from the airplane. Looked for fire and the smell of fuel, and I didn't see or smell anything. I looked back inside again and made sure that everything was off, and all the switches were off, fuel was off, everything was off, and we evacuated the airplane. And that's when the hard work really started, because now we had to dodge the blackberry bushes and make sure that we wouldn't get hurt, because until now, not a scratch on any of us. So it was surreal. We found a path out and popped out in a neighborhood in a cul-de-sac with a whole bunch of people asking us if we were all right.
Wow, that sounds surreal for sure. Take us back a little bit. First of all, what version of Cirrus was this, and how old was it?
Yeah, this is a Cirrus SR22 Turbo, November 927 Charlie Sierra. It is a Generation 5. And the engine had about 700 hours of total time on it.
And I'm guessing at this point you haven't heard exactly what happened to the engine. Have they done any analysis yet?
No, I talked to the NTSB actually about a couple of weeks ago. They took the engine out of the airplane, sent it to Continental. They opened up the case and sent a whole bunch of stuff out to the lab just to determine what failed and what went wrong. So, to be determined.
And during the event itself, which obviously was fairly short, were you ever scared, or how did you kind of react in the moment? What was that like?
Not scared. I just got to work. I mean, we trained for this, and as an instructor, you get a lot of opportunity to prepare yourself for a situation like this. See, for a learner that flies 60 hours a year, how many times do they really repeat and drill those emergency procedures? For an instructor, I think it's different because, we work in this type of environment all the time. So I just got to work, and there was no feeling or emotion involved. I was very calm and just did what needed to be done in order to guarantee a safe outcome. That and a little bit of luck, of course. What an amazing day.
Yes, we're always happy when we get luck anytime in life, especially when we're flying, though. I'm curious, what kind of airspeed were you at when you pulled the parachute, and did you end up opening the doors prior to reaching the ground?
The airspeed was best glide speed, so under the magical 133 knots. And no, we opted to keep the doors closed.
So tell us more about the aftermath. You arrived with your student at the cul-de-sac. You had encountered some people there, and what happened next?
So I texted my wife, and I said, hey, we have been in an incident. Everybody is okay. Then everything goes so fast nowadays. I think the internet picked up on it within like 5 or 10 minutes because they started getting a lot of text from other people. Fire department showed up probably about 3 or 4 minutes after we crawled out, and it took us about 5 minutes or so to crawl out of the bushes. So they were there quickly. And then the whole circus started of who we are, what happened, what the state of the airplane is, how much fuel there is, how many people were there, et cetera, et cetera. So it was an interesting experience because, the cops didn't really know what to do. So they just kind of guarded the airplane and kind of guarded us until the FAA or NTSB would show up, whoever was first. So funny enough, it took the NTSB probably about an hour and a half to get to the scene. And we just wrote out a statement of, basically what I just told you. And that was it. We were on our way home. So the incident happened at about 5 o'clock. I think when everything was done and over with, my wife picked me up, and I got in the car at about 8 o'clock. I had a cup of coffee at 8:30 when we got home. And I had a meeting the next morning at 9 o'clock. And all that because of the parachute of the Cirrus. Just to put things in perspective, we were gliding for 70 seconds. We hung underneath the parachute for about 25 seconds. So the whole thing between engine seizing and touching the ground only lasted 95 seconds. And I can tell you right now, Max, without the parachute, that situation would have been completely different. This was a relatively low altitude failure in a dense urban area. I don't care how good of a pilot you are. I don't think there was a possibility that you would walk away from this unscratched without the parachute. There was no way you could land that airplane there anywhere.
Yeah, sometimes we just don't have a lot of good options. So it sounds like the parachute became an excellent option for you at that point. I'm curious, how did they recover the aircraft from that wooded area?
So there was a lot of talking about how to get the airplane out. And there was 2 options. Option number 1 was to get a helicopter in and just fly the airplane out. I think there was some issues with permits going over these dense urban areas. So they took the wings off, hoisted it out, put it on a trailer, and got it back to the home airport in a hangar, secured.
And have you had any interactions with the insurance company?
Oh, yes. So as a matter of fact, I've had interactions with all alphabet organizations, which is FAA, NTSB, and the insurance company. The FAA, and this was very interesting, what this really was about was the administrative part of this whole investigation, was the annual completed, where all ADs complied with. How about the squawks on the airplane? How about, my paperwork? Did I have a pilot certificate and the medical, et cetera, et cetera? So it was pretty matter of fact, very organized. They just use a checklist and they check the boxes. NTSB, pretty much the same. The interesting part was the insurance company was the hardest one to satisfy. They needed to know exactly how many flight hours I had logged to the decimal, which was surprising because the FAA was, I got 15,000 hours of flight time. And that was good enough for the FAA. The insurance company needed to know it's 15,223.6 hours. So I asked him, does this landing count then or not in my logbook? And I didn't have an answer.
That's good. You have a good sense of humor about this.
Well, again, it's because we walked away unscratched. And it looks like the airplane sustained minor damage. Hopefully, there will be a road back for that aircraft. As I understand, 31 Cirri found their way back into the air, and hopefully this airplane will be a candidate for that too.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think when Cirrus Aircraft originally came out, they believed that any aircraft that had its parachute pulled would never be back in service, and yet probably 15-20% of them have made their way back into the fleet, which is great. So did this constitute an accident or an incident?
This became an incident. So nobody got hurt. The airplane sustained minor damage. We didn't damage anything else besides some blackberries. So, yeah, a miracle, really, after such a violent seizure of an engine to be able to walk away from an incident.
Right. So there was no structural damage, so therefore it became an incident versus an accident.
Correct.
Did you end up getting scratched as you came out of there by the blackberries?
Yeah, a little bit. So like I said, that was the hardest part of the whole day was trying to find our way through the blackberry bushes. I remember walking around very, very carefully, and at some point I couldn't keep walking. And I look down and I see these blackberry vines just digging into my stomach. So I had to rip those out. And I guess if there's any injuries, that's I picked up some scratches and I got wet feet because I had to step in a puddle of water. So that was it.
Isn't that interesting that you survived an engine failure, a parachute pull, and the most dangerous aspect was trying to walk through the bushes?
It's, it's hilarious. It's so funny. And I think that's where it just proves how valuable the CAP system is, because we can just think about these trivial kind of things.
Tell us a little bit about how you felt afterwards in the succeeding days. Any kind of feelings of, well, whatever, that this was not normal, and tell us what that was like as you kind of processed it over the next few days or weeks.
I didn't really do much with that. So my wife was very concerned because she said, well, you're way too calm and collected about this, and there is going to be a point where this is going to hit you. And 3 months later, and I'm still feeling the same about it. It is what it is. It ended well. There's not much we could have done different, and I have peace with it. It's just another day at work. So yeah, maybe I don't have a very vivid emotional life. I don't know, but it didn't affect me much. I did do a debrief with my learner, and we met a couple days later at one of the local coffee places, and his story was a little different. And we've done a couple of seminars and presentations together to educate the pilot population, because for him at 400 hours as a private pilot instrument rated, this was a big thing. And all he was thinking about is, I cannot believe this is happening to me. And that caused him to kind of seize for 10, 15 seconds. And afterwards, he really walked around for a few days like, I can't believe I survived a plane crash. And I told him, well, technically speaking, it wasn't a crash. It was an incident. But yeah, he struggled a little bit. So we talked and we debriefed, and he's back flying airplanes.
I'm happy to hear that. I think for many years, certainly before I became a CFI, I had a feeling as I read about all these stories, oh, these things will never happen to me. And I think it's easy for people to kind of rationalize their flying that way. And yet I still remember when I had the first vacuum pump failure when I was flying a Cessna 182 on top of the clouds without an instrument rating, thinking, oh, great, now if the engine fails, I'm going down through those clouds.
You're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, exactly right. So I turned around, went back to my origin and left the airplane there and drove instead. But yeah, the more you fly, the more you come to realize, no, actually, any of these things can and will happen to you if you fly long enough.
Correct. It's a numbers game. The more you fly, the more you are going to experience abnormal situations. And the only thing you can control is how well you prepare for those, which means not only going through the PUH and learning the boldface items and practicing flows, but actually thinking about these things and trying to work out these scenarios so you have some to-go-to procedural ways of working these type of occurrences. Because, like you said, you fly enough, it's going to happen to you at some point.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you first gave a presentation on this, we were sitting in a room with perhaps, about 30 people, many of them flight instructors. And there was someone else in the room who had also previously had a parachute pull. And of course, I've met at least I can think of 3 other people that I've met who've had parachute pulls. I think to some extent, as you and I are highly involved in this community, we're doing lots of flying, it's almost starting to become normal in the sense that, hey, there have been more than 100 of these events. They virtually all turned out well. This is part of the work that we do. And if it happens, as long as we've trained for it and prepared, there's a high probability there's going to be a good outcome. So I can kind of see why you might have walked away from this and not particularly felt traumatized.
Not at all. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because for about 2 seconds after the engine stopped, I was thinking, where am I going to land that airplane? And even with all that training and all that time in Cirrus, what is it? I still had the initial thought, I have to land that airplane. And that's such a departure of what we have learned. We always learned to save the airplane to save ourselves. And in the Cirrus, that is absolutely not true. You pull the parachute within the parameters, you are going home. And I'm not a gambling man, but boy, I certainly will choose for the sure thing every single time.
Well, there's certainly been times when I've been flying other aircraft and we've been, in situations where if I were to have lost the engine, I would have been in a bad situation.
Yeah.
And it's often crossing my mind in those moments, oh, I wish I were in a Cirrus right now on this particular flight.
Absolutely. And I compare it with airbags in cars and seatbelts in cars and all the active and passive technology that keeps us safe in aircraft in Cirrus. We have that available to us. And it is up to the Cirrus instructors to change the mindset of the pilots flying these aircraft and getting away from trying to land the airplane. Because, and I practice this with the people that I fly with. I always ask them, hey, if we get an engine failure right now, are you able to land this Cirrus at this airport that's right underneath us? And we maybe are 2,000-3,000 feet over that airport, and I let them run the scenario until we get to the situation where we know it's not going to happen. They're not going to be able to land. And, we always end up with, we would have pulled the parachute. So it's a departure of what we've been taught, a lot of pilots. So luckily, Cirrus has been around for a long time now. And there's a whole new generation of pilots that trained in Cirrus, and they don't know any better. So, they will pull the chute, hopefully.
Yeah, one of the things I enjoyed when I was at the meeting that you and I were at in Seattle was the opportunity to talk with Luke Lyson, who I hadn't seen in a few years, and he's a co-founder of the Flight Academy. And one of the things I told him was that probably 15 years earlier, he had given a presentation at, San Luis Obispo Airport or Santa Maria. I think it was San Luis Obispo, in which he had said that if I have an engine failure, unless there's an airport below me, I'm going to go ahead and pull the parachute. And that really crystallized the thinking for me, which was really helpful because now you're no longer in that situation of, should I pull or should I not pull? And one of the other things we talked about at that particular meeting in Seattle was, is that always the best guidance? Should you always go for the airport and try to land it? One of the flight instructors there said that she had noticed that when people simulated trying to reach the airport with the engine out, that I think she said only about 20% of the people actually got to the airport successfully. And I've seen that as well, that a significant percentage of people, when we practice that, don't manage the glide properly to the airport. So even more reason to consider using the parachute in whatever type of aircraft you've been in. For example, I've talked with a parachute survivor who was in a Cessna 182, and he had modified it to have a parachute in that aircraft. And what else have I flown? CTLS, I think I flew years ago with a parachute. So lots of different aircraft that now have that. So it's bringing us a whole new set of capabilities that we never had years ago. Well, so I think a key thing that comes out of this conversation is that regardless of what kind of aircraft that you're flying, you really need to be practicing emergency procedures. Any suggestions that you have for pilots of whatever aircraft they fly?
Absolutely. So, of course, it starts with the bookwork and flowing emergencies. I think the simulator is a very underutilized tool where you can put yourself into situations and let them play out all the way to where you wouldn't allow a real airplane to go. You can reset, you can do terrible things to yourself or the students, the learners. I think it's really important to put that in a training environment and put it in a curriculum and work with the simulator to get better, to react appropriately, to make it more procedural and less emotional.
Yeah, and that way you'll be ready when an event occurs like this.
And it happens. It happens every day. And it's funny. Things don't go wrong a lot of times because we're bad pilots. Things go wrong because we got busy. We got stuck in a task and we were not able to see the big picture anymore. And unfortunately, it ends up in a loss of control, right? Unfortunately, many pilots still die because they tried to do it, but they just kind of ran out of time, altitude, or options.
Well, I think also task overload.
Yeah.
Think about emergencies. That really stresses people out and narrows their focus. And it's pretty easy at that point in time to lose track of something. And that something sometimes is airspeed.
Certainly is. Airspeed is life.
Indeed. Jim, thanks so much for joining us here today and sharing your story.
Thank you so much for having me.
And my thanks to Jim Simon for joining us here today. If you're ever in the Seattle area and looking to fly, check out his flight school, Rainier Flight Service at the Renton Airport. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. But most importantly, please tell one or more of your friends about the show. That's the primary way that we grow the show. So please let your friends know about Aviation News Talk. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can